It's not the ideas aren't there, and it's not that people aren't willing, but there are lots of individual barriers, and you also have to have this combination of actions and changes that make real radical action still very difficult.
Climate change is happening. The window of opportunity for action is closing, and regulators are moving too slowly. Realizing that our leaders are risking their future, students finally took to the streets in the Fridays for Future movement. When politicians tried to dismiss the protests, Scientists for Future published a statement that the protests were justified, with 26,000 scientists being signatories. They now organize science communication, fact-checking and consulting for policymakers, and they critique the policies that are being implemented. Scientists for Future is a model organization for scientists playing their role in society, so I am working on a series that will feature members of Scientists for Future regularly. In this episode, we talk about one of the larger sectors contributing to greenhouse emissions: mobility and transport. I'm your host, Dennis Eckmeyer, and you're listening to episode 50 of Science for Societal Progress.
I'm Dr. Jonathan Koehler. I work at the Fraunhofer Institute for Innovation and Systems Analysis in Karlsruhe, Germany. I am in the sustainability department working on sustainable transport, both mobility in terms of personal transport and also in freight transport and logistics. And I also am active in the development of innovation theory, in particular the ideas around transitions, which have become popular in the last few years.
So what's your career path, basically? What did you start out wanting to do when you were young, and what happened then?
Right. Well, that's a long story, but I'll try not to take too long about it. So when I was young, growing up, I was interested in things military, and my father was a machine and mechanical engineer, and so I went to technical college and studied mechanical engineering. And then when I finished, I got a job as a mechanical engineer and then a naval architect, Schiffsbauingenieur, designing ships with the English Ministry of Defence, designing military ships. And I did that for a few years in various ways, but gradually became more interested in politics, and in particular in Green politics. I was a member of the Green Party in the 1980s, the English Green Party, which was then and is still very small compared to Germany. So after a few years as a naval architect with the Ministry of Defence, I left all that for a while and went back to university and studied economics. And I did a master's and then a PhD in behavioural economics, and then finished that in 1996. And I was then lucky enough to get a job at Cambridge University, not in behavioural economics, but in computer simulations of environmental policy with a well-known group there. And I won't go into the reasons for that, otherwise I'm here all day. So there was another sudden shift of direction, which of course was in line with my interest in environmental issues. And I then worked for around 10 or 11 years in Cambridge University, doing computer simulations of environmental policy in both energy and increasingly in energy fields. And then I got more interested in the innovation side of things and how technologies could change and society might change, because it became apparent to me that for sustainability you need large-scale changes in society and as well as technology. And then through contacts in a European project, I got this job in Fraunhofer, where I've been since 2008. And so what that has led me to do is firstly look at sustainable transport from the point of view of innovation studies and innovation ideas. And I've specialized, as I said, in what's called transitions theory in terms of the innovation ideas, and I've implemented that in computer simulation models, in particular agent-based simulation models. An agent-based model has lots and lots of different decision makers, usually thousands. In my models, I have 1,000 decision makers, and this can go up to millions. And the idea is that each decision maker makes decisions for themselves in the same surroundings, but with their own individual decision preferences, let's put it that way. So you get an emergent pattern. You run the simulation through various time periods and you get an emergent pattern of change, and the interactions are extremely complex. You can't do it mathematically, analytically. You've got to do it by simulation methods. And what you find is that you get interesting patterns of how decisions change and behavior changes. And in my examples around mobility, and I've also worked a lot now in shipping innovation, going back to my naval architectural roots, you get interesting patterns of how new technologies come up, and then they might really take off, or they might not. And a good example of that at the moment is liquid natural gas propulsion in shipping, which has been all the rage over the last 5 years because of environmental legislation about local air pollution, and liquid natural gas burns very, very cleanly. But it is still a fossil fuel, so in terms of the greenhouse gas debate, it's not much use. So there's a question about whether it will actually be a large-scale technology in the future or not. And these agent-based models are very good at capturing lots of different possibilities for that.
How do you define an agent and how it would respond to different information?
In my modeling, an agent has been either a household determining their mobility technology or their mobility lifestyle. That's what I published on previously. And in the new variation on ships, there are two sorts of agents: the so-called technology providers, firms, shipyards that build ships, and the specialist manufacturers that make engines or sails or whatever. And they decide what their technology offer is going to be, so to speak, and in which directions they're going to develop it in a very simple way in my models. And on the other side, there are ship owners, people who want to buy new ships to transport stuff. And they then choose which of the different technologies available they adopt, according to, again, in my model, a broad set of criteria. Most technology choice models use just environmental performance, capital cost, and operational costs. And I've tried to expand these decision parameters with psychological variables like, are you willing to adopt new technologies? Are you willing to change your operational patterns? Things like that.
So I remember that in economics, for a long time, they assumed a very rational consumer behavior. Is that what you're trying to overcome by including these psychological variables?
Yes, exactly. The problem with conventional economic models is that they always assumed an average consumer or an average household or an average firm or whatever. And that actually, it's not always misrepresenting what's going on, but often is. And in particular, in innovation theory, it is well known from consumer theory from the 1950s that the diffusion of new technologies starts off with a few early adopters. Then it gets taken up, if it's successful, by the majority. And then there are also another group that are so-called laggards. In other words, given the same technology, given the same economic circumstances, there are groups of decision makers who act in different ways, given the same information. And that means that in order to represent innovation in society, you have to take this difference between the various groups into account, which is what conventional models don't do, and why agent-based models are better, because they address that problem.
Mm-hmm. So you did look into research on psychological decision behavior in the real world, and then use that as a
I did. That's what I wrote my PhD thesis on.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, cool.
In my case, in savings decisions. But yeah, and there's a big literature on empirical observation about how people make economic choices. It's not in the mainstream literature so much. It had a brief phase of popularity about 20 years ago when I was doing my PhD.
What insights did you gain from your research so far?
The fundamental insight is that radical change in both land mobility and in shipping transport is possible. It is highly uncertain, so you've got to have a series of factors that push the system in a direction of radical change for sustainability. In other words, the conventional policy measures that are used in transport nowadays, which are essentially taxes mostly, and price incentives on fuel or purchase costs don't work. You get some response, but very small responses. And that in order to have rapid change, what can drive rapid change is drastic regulation, and that then depends upon the context. So in personal mobility in households, how households choose their mobility, there are a whole range of factors. That's what makes it so complicated, because it's where you live. Does where you live assume fundamentally that you've got a motor car, like in widely spread suburbs in big cities? Is there good public transport, or do you have a form of town planning where they say, right, you've got lots of cycleways, lots of easy access for pedestrians to the local shops and administrative services, or the places where they work, and good access to local public transport so you can get around without cars? That's a possibility, but it then has to be organised not just through personal decisions, but through the town planning. So you need a whole load of things to come together to make it happen. And in the technology decisions, like in shipping, it's simpler, because there you've got firms who are really are driven by profit. So nominally, they're worried about their costs and how to be efficient. They will respond to environmental regulation if you put it in place, but they are still very wary, and there's the variability about using different operational patterns, sailing much slower to save energy, for example, or adopting new technologies. So what you do to drive change, you have to find out where the real pressure points are and use a combination of them, both in almost all examples in transport. That's why it's such an interesting field for me.
Right.
That's the first main insight. And the other main insight is that what you think is happening and is going to be the thing in the future now might change in a few years' time. If, as in the case of shipping and aeroplanes and road transport at the moment, you can see that there is greenhouse gas legislation coming along, but it's not really enforced yet. So, as in this case of liquid natural gas in ships, that's been promoted very heavily by various bodies in the industry. And they've built a few ships, and they're developing an infrastructure to supply liquid natural gas fuel to ships. But if you get stringent greenhouse gas regulation, then it's not a way forward. And you've got to think. So if you're in the industry now, you're wondering, do I go for LNG and meet the current environmental legislation? Or do I try and modify the engines I already have at maybe more cost and problems? But that leaves me free in 5 years' time to make a more drastic change. And they've flown a lot of demonstrations with a sort of 10-20% biofuel mix with conventional fuels in passenger aircraft. They've flown one freight aircraft across the Atlantic with 100% biofuel. So the technology is there. There are two problems. Firstly, these biofuels are very expensive because the supply chain infrastructure is there. And the other problem is the development of a whole new supply production chain. So it's not the aircraft delivery end of the supply chain that's the problem. It's where is all your biomass going to come from to supply a very big industry.
Right.
The Americans now run their military. The United States Air Force runs most of their aircraft on biofuels. So you can do it. But the fuels at the moment cost about 2 to 4 times as much as conventional fuels. And a lot of them are first generation from rapeseed oils, which is not particularly sustainable. That's also been a problem with biofuels.
Yeah.
So what they've got to do now, if they're going to go down that route, is develop large-scale so-called second-generation processes to produce genuinely carbon-neutral biofuels. And that's still in development, so that's all expensive. And then, like I say, you've got to do it for, it's sort of 30,000-40,000, if I remember right, of commercial airliners.
Right.
So you need a whole new industry, basically. But that's the way aviation is going to go if they get real greenhouse gas mitigation policy in place. That's problematic because, like shipping, most of the emissions come over international waters. So that means national countries can't legislate, and most of the policy making gets done through international organizations. That's the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO for aviation, and the International Maritime Organization for ships. And there you've got each country represented. So it's like the Kyoto or Paris process. Each country is represented in the discussions, and the diplomacy is really, really complicated and very slow moving.
Jonathan Koehler is very knowledgeable about technological developments in the field, and in the original conversation we gave many interesting examples and details that I had to cut for this episode. But you can listen to the whole conversation, which features 30 minutes of additional information, on our Patreon page, if you become a patron. You can pledge any amount you like to get instant access to this conversation and to 40 additional extended versions of older episodes. Check it out on www.patreon.com/sci4progress. And I want to thank those of our listeners who are already supporting us. It really helps. In the following, we enter what I intended to be a quick question and answer round, but realized that the answers did need some additional explanation of about 2 to 4 minutes each. Which solution do you think would be best for a carbon-neutral personal mobility?
For personal transport, at the moment, lithium-ion batteries. The main advantage of lithium-ion batteries is that if you've got renewable electricity supply, they involve very few emissions. You've got to worry about the disposable or the recycling of the batteries themselves, but that's solvable. But you can make them just about climate neutral. There is now a technology in lithium-ion batteries which has been developed enough to be practical for both cars and to a limited extent for trucks, though trucks is more problematic. But certainly for cars, as current cars are, you can realistically have a battery electric vehicle, and that covers almost all of your transport needs, if not all of them. And the advantage of that then is that it's renewable. In comparison to other things like power to liquids or hydrogen, you don't have any conversion technologies. And for example, with hydrogen, you've got about a 60% energy loss to make the hydrogen from renewable energy. So energetically, using it directly in a battery is much, much better, much better. And because renewable energies, wind turbines and solar power are also limited in their production because you require all these really big wind farms or all these really big solar panel fields, that's also an important consideration. And of course, it makes it much cheaper. The only other thing I would say for lorries, batteries aren't powerful enough in the current technology. They don't have enough energy density. There are various possibilities then. One thing they're doing in Germany and in other places is putting overhead catenary on motorways for lorries, like an electric train with overhead pickup. Another possibility is fuel cells. That's also in development. So it's much less clear with trucks as opposed to cars.
How bad are cruise ships?
They're pretty bad. Cruise shipping has boomed, so there's lots of money in it, and they're building more and more and bigger cruise ships. And the biggest cruise ships now carry, I think it's 6,000 passengers, weigh 150,000 tons, and they've got about 60 to 70 megawatts of power on board. So if you're using conventional fossil fuels, they chuck out an awfully large amount of crap, to use the colloquial term, but greenhouse gas emissions, soot, and also nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxide. That has already caused a lot of regulation, in particular local air pollution issues. Because they're so big, they completely dominate the tourist destinations. Bergen, which is not that small, and it's not the biggest cruise destination, but it's quite a big cruise destination. And it's a city on the coast in a bowl of hills. And if you have half a dozen of these ships in port, they use actually half of their power for lighting, heating, so-called hotel loads. So even when they're stopped, they're using lots of power. And they were emitting lots and lots of emissions into this bowl around Bergen, and it just stayed there. So it was really affecting the pollution. And that's one of the reasons why Norway was very early in developing local air legislation for shipping. And that and also the availability of liquid natural gas in the Norwegian oil fields in the North Sea led to an early set of proposals, an early push for liquid natural gas as a propulsion in ships. There are alternatives to cruise shipping. You have so-called dual fuel motors, whereby you can either use diesel fuels or you can use liquid natural gas with special tanks and special systems. And if you're burning liquid natural gas, then almost all the local air pollution goes away. You don't have it anymore. You've still got the fossil fuel problem, though.
Right.
So cruise ships are pretty bad. But what does bad mean? If people are willing to pay to make them emission-free, then that's fair enough. And the technologies are there to do it. Or rather, they're almost there. So there's liquid natural gas, so you can remove the local air pollution either with liquid natural gas or with lots of equipment added onto your diesel to take all the pollution out of the exhaust pipe and store it somewhere. Although that doesn't always work. And what's happened in 2020, from the 1st of January, there was a global limit on sulfur emissions from ships operating globally. So there's been a change in legislation. What's happened is that most ship owners haven't put in liquid natural gas because it's complicated and new and expensive, and they've put in the so-called scrubbing equipment, and then they just dump the sludge overboard. So all the crap actually goes into the sea at the moment, which is not very good.
No.
So the legislation has been effective in reducing the emissions from ships, but the stuff's still there.
Yeah.
So it requires further development of legislation, and liquid natural gas is only going to be fossil-free when you use it from synthetic sources, the so-called power to liquids, which is still like for aircraft in development. So cruise ships at the moment are pretty bad. Having said that, there aren't many of them. So each individual ship is a lot, but compared to all the emissions from aviation or road transport or even freight shipping, it's not so much. But having said that, the emissions are often in areas of natural beauty. So along the Siberian coast in the Arctic, or up the Northwest America, or up the coast of Norway, or whatever. So they often, if they do emit, they're emitting in particularly sensitive environmental areas as well. So they're still pretty problematic.
How will ships and aircraft become carbon neutral?
The obvious solution now is to adopt either biofuels on a large scale or to develop the power to liquid infrastructure so they can either run on biofuels or power to liquids using aircraft as they more or less are.
Right.
That's the most likely way for aircraft. With ships, there are a range of different possibilities, so it's hard to give such a clear answer. But a likely answer is that for freight shipping, there will be some form of combination of fast and slow ships with some form of combination of power to liquids or fuel cells with wind technologies, and power to liquids for ships that need to go fast and have a lot of power, like cruise ships or large container ships. But even with container ships, that's not clear because you can sail container ships slowly. They sail fast at the moment, but you can sail them much slower because most of the stuff on them, like teddy bears from China or barrels of chemicals or cars, you don't need to sail them very fast. It's an economic decision of whether you do or not. Right. So for ships, I reckon you have a combination of wind, power to liquid, synthetic fuels, and maybe fuel cells for most applications.
How can the government push us all into the transition?
That's the trickiest question of all, actually. As well as the willingness of the industry to change, which is beginning to happen. You also pushed by legislation so far, so only partial. You also need a change in culture, really, as well, to say, we want these changes to happen. And again, that's also happening, but only slowly. But there are now, if you talk to logistics people now, they do say some people are willing to pay more for low emissions transport. And a lot of people are asking what emissions are associated with the production and transportation of my good. And that needs to be strengthened. People need to be made aware of how much emissions they cause by ordering their pair of shoes, for example, from China through a global production chain, or their mobile telephone, which is also made in various bits in the world and shipped around. So you need a great awareness on the part of people, and also a cultural awareness that environmental issues are important. And then you've got to translate that into policy measures in the political system which is why I got into Scientists for the Future, because there's a window of opportunity there, which we'll talk about in a minute, no doubt. So you need the culture and the people to change their attitudes. They've got to put pressure on the political system to make legislation and to organize these new systems so that the industries providing services are willing to change their organizational structures, their operations, that you're willing to, for example, to stop driving your car every 3 hours and have a break, that you are willing to sail your ships much slower so that the goods take longer to get there, that you are willing to fly less or much more slowly. That would also save energy. So they're willing to think about all these operational changes, which is only just beginning to be thought about. I joined about 10 or 11 months ago, last year.
This conversation was recorded on March 19th, 2020.
What happened was, as the Fridays for the Future movement started to get going, which is now sort of about 15 to 18 months ago, sort of autumn 2018, some scientists said, well, the debate is full of false information. We need to find a way of channeling the scientific information that is out there to all the people who are interested so that they can have a debate and make decisions based on what is actually known as opposed to just hearsay. It just so happened that one of the people who was interested in this, a woman called Sissy Knispel, who lives locally in Karlsruhe, where I am, but also got active in the National Scientists for the Future organization, which is based in Berlin, but it's pretty virtual, said, well, I'm in the national organization. I think we should also have a group in Karlsruhe. And she talked to people at the local university, and they've got a group there who've done quite a lot of environmental work called ETAS. They study technology assessment. So they do the social science of technology, similar field to mine. These guys, ETAS and Sissy Knispel together, said, right, let's send an email out and see whether we can find any people, local scientists who are interested in joining them. And one email came to the Fraunhofer Institute where I am. And that was an obvious place to go because we've got not just my department on sustainability, we've got 2 departments on sustainable energy as well. So we're well known for being in that field. And I thought, yeah, I really think that what Fridays for the Future are doing it's a real opportunity to change society that hasn't been there before. So I'd like to support it. And in my field of sustainable transport, I think I've got specialist knowledge and a wide range of knowledge in the different aspects of transport that could be helpful. So I went along to the initial meetings for Scientists for the Future, and that's how I got involved. And what that has turned out to mean is sort of answering requests for information and presentation and organizing information events. So I've been involved, and the group has been involved in a range of activities around talking to mostly schools at the moment, not so much industry or universities, but the local university has got its own organization around sustainability. Also, we've worked with the media. I was on Kika for an interview about sustainable aviation last summer.
Kika is a TV channel for children by the German Public Broadcasting Services.
Which was really cool. People from Fridays. What else have we done? Participated in conferences around sustainability locally in the local area to say, yes, if you want information about sustainability, you can use us as a pool of expert knowledge, or you can come and join and contribute your knowledge. So we've done a lot of work of that. So that's what I started off doing with scientists. I did quite a lot of work sort of last summer, and it's dropped off a little bit since because I got too busy with other things, and also because I actually joined Fridays as well as an active member, which is a bit unusual for somebody my age. But I was in an initial meeting with them, and one of their guys said, well, you've got some interesting things to say. Would you like to come and take part in our discussion? So I've done that as well. So I've supported, that's partly scientific work because there's Karlsruhe as a town have been developing their climate strategy. So I've gone along to meetings about that with the local political parties. and also helped comment on the climate strategy. Not so much. I've done a little bit, not so much on the organisation demos because that's where you need a lot of time and they can do that already. So I've just helped out in demos. But it's really a more effective way of actually providing the scientific input, because although Scientists for the Future was set up to support Fridays, and we usually have somebody from Fridays for the Future at our meetings, everybody's so busy that the communication it works, but it's slow and limited. So actually being in Fridays and going to their meetings regularly makes quite a lot of difference about being able to put in scientific input into their discussions, which they're very keen to have.
Yeah.
So I fulfill a sort of dual role. And the first part in the scientists is what most of the scientists are doing, sort of trying to find ways of communicating their scientific knowledge to various different interested audiences, in particular, though, schools and in the local political process. There's a big discussion process in Karlsruhe with all sorts of for the future organizations grown up around the climate strategy and the Fridays for the Future movement. So we're contributing to that. And then there's this work which is more directly with politics, actually, which I think is very good and very important with Fridays.
Right. So you talk to policymakers directly. How effective is that? Do you feel it's very effective? Do people understand?
They understand, certainly. The effectiveness is not, it's a complicated story. The first thing to say is that there is, in Karlsruhe, as in all towns in Germany, there in the local administration, there is a whole department around environmental issues. It's headed up by one of the mayors. In the German system, of course, you have lots of mayors, not just one.
Right.
So there's a so-called Bürgermeister für Umwelt, and she's in the Green Party. She's a member of the Green Party, but she's very effective, very well organized. But as often happens, the environmental legislation is certainly so far in current society, in Germany as well as in the UK, it's an add-on to everything else. So it's not really at the center of people's thinking all the time. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. So that limits their ability to change things. And in the climate strategy, for example, that they just developed, a major criticism is that they concentrated very much on what they thought they could do within the administration and without trying to ask industry to do very much or people to change their behavior very much. So it's a new climate strategy that shows every sign of being very, very limited. We'll see. We've made precisely this criticism. Lots of people have made precisely this criticism, so we'll see. So it's there's a climate strategy being developed, but what will actually happen with it is still uncertain. So you have to say, not sure. The more positive side of the story is that at least the main political parties, and in particular in Karlsruhe, the CDU,
the Christian Democratic Union, the center-right party in Germany,
have realized, partly against their will, but partly from within, is my impression, that environment isn't actually an important issue. And that's, for the CDU, is new. In Karlsruhe, Grünen Bündnis 90 have got the largest fraction in the Gemeinderat. So they're the largest group in the local town council.
Bündnis 90, die Grünen, is the German Green Party.
And they're, of course, completely on side. And Die Linke are also very interested in this sort of issue.
Die Linke is the German Socialist Party.
Especially with a social slant, which is entirely reasonable and also very good. And the SPD, I think they're struggling.
SPD is center-left, the German Social Democrats.
But the interesting thing is that most of the major political parties, the FDP are a bit of a nightmare still.
FDP are a sort of moderate libertarians.
But they're not very big in Karlsruhe.
Right.
So they don't seem to be so interested. But the other major political parties are either actively in supporting this or at least see it as a major issue. And how willing they are to undertake radical change is very variable. So we've got an Oberbürgermeister, the mayor of Karlsruhe, who is a very intelligent man from the SPD. He's been a very effective town mayor for quite a few years now.
Mm-hmm.
He's worried about the political consequences of taking action within Karlsruhe that will require people to change what they do very much. So one thing you can do to reduce emissions fairly quickly is to drastically reduce the car use. And you can drastically reduce the car use by not allowing people to drive into town centres. Entirely possible to do, requires some organisation. In Karlsruhe, we've got an excellent tram network and a complementary bus network. So you would have to build park and ride schemes and build more cycleways, but you could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not in the realms of the politically possible at the moment, according certainly to the town mayor. So when you talk to the political and administrative actors in and around Karlsruhe, they're all talking about marginal things. So they're very proud of enforcing parking restrictions, or rather enforcing parking rules which say you're not allowed to park on cycleways or pavements in the town centre, which is actually important, but it's really minor, right? And that's, for them, is the best thing they've achieved in 20 years.
Yeah.
So the idea of fundamentally changing the town and getting people out of it, really most people out of their cars, is still out there somewhere in the political future. So at the moment, there's a lot of talk and not much real action, but plans are being made. It is also true, though, and this is why I joined Fridays in particular, that the political pressure from society outside the political parties and the administrations is it's at a new level. You know, it's now much higher than it was just 2 years ago. And if that pressure is maintained, that will change, certainly in towns like Karlsruhe, where a lot of people are beginning to take environmental issues seriously. So in particular, the big demonstration that we had last September, organised by Fridays in Karlsruhe, had, I think it was 20 to 25,000 people. So that's compared to a total population of Karlsruhe of 300,000. So it's, in terms of numbers, 10% of the population. So a lot of people who would be willing to change if they had the possibility and if it didn't disrupt their lives and what they do too much. But all that to come together requires a lot of combined actions. That's the difficult thing. It's not the ideas aren't there, and it's not that people aren't willing, but there are lots of individual barriers, and you also have to have this combination of actions and changes that make real radical action still very difficult.
How do you envision the future of society after the transition to climate neutrality?
Right. So there are lots of versions. The version that I personally like the best is one where transport is slower. There is much more green space. People use walking and cycling to get around locally more. And there is a proper provision for both slow cycles, fast cycles, cycles with trailers for going shopping. And a lot of people use those. You don't see cars in the streets. In fact, there are no streets as we have them because there are cycleways or pedestrian ways. And you have public transport systems, not as dense network as the current roads, enabling you to get around town. In the country, we'd have to see, maybe they would have autonomous vehicles or something like that because there the traffic densities are much lower. That's my vision for a carbon neutral town or city. And in terms of long distance transport, much more public transport. But I think autonomous vehicles will have a big influence on culture. So I can see long distance transport turning into various forms of public transport. Some of it will be trains, and they can be automated as well. Some of it will be on roads where the traffic density is less. You might have small flexible buses. So you would have a system of renewable energy based transport systems which are essentially a combination of high mass transport public modes like we see nowadays and sort of private pods or something, if you like, and various combinations. So it's also small. So these pods could be car sheds. You might own one if you wanted. but I could see a future where if you've got an automated pod, in 20 or 30 years' time, you have your own program for how you want this pod configured. So you get into this pod and you put in or you've already sent it by internet, your personal set of preferences, and the car reconfigures itself to have either seating places, beds, a kitchen, an office space, or whatever. So you don't have a car as a car anymore. You have a transport vehicle, and if you want to go from A to B, that's what you use it for. It's personalized, but you don't own it, is the important thing. So then the idea of around this car culture of owning and showing your power through your car is much reduced. And if you want to drive a high-powered fossil fuel or power-to-liquid fuel car very fast, then you go to a racing car track and do it. And maybe there will be more of those for the people who like doing that sort of thing, or rallies or whatever. And in terms of international transport, much less aviation, I think, will be the way to go. You can have international passenger transport in ships. It only requires a week to cross the Atlantic in a fairly fast ship. And then that will be reliant on, and it's mostly business travel, but you would certainly need a ship with really high quality remote communication, like we're all practicing now, but much better, so that somebody who is a business person can have meeting after meeting after meeting, not get too tired, communicate properly with all the people in their network all over the world while they are traveling, for when they travel. And that is perfectly achievable vision. You could have them partly sail-powered if you wanted. And so you could have a combination of faster and medium and slower ships. And I think in this sort of future, wind would almost certainly play a significant part because the economic advantages are so large. And like I say, for aeroplanes, I would see them being, over the next 50 years, they would look more or less the same, and they would have to have carbon neutral fuels. And then there is an open question which hasn't properly been thought through yet as to whether you make all these fuels to meet the current level of demand, or whether you say, no, you haven't got quite enough fuels and you have to restrict the use of aviation in some way, but have a better alternative in surface transport with ships. And of course, inside Europe, for example, fast railway trains, which are almost as good for most purposes. So that's how I see future.
Cool. So it's a lot of taking work on the road. It's like slowing down the travel, but then have the travel being comfortable and productive.
Yeah, for long distances, yes.
A lot of the conversations about mobility in the city is about making the inner cities more accessible for bicycles and pedestrians while removing infrastructure for cars. I wondered how people who are unable to ride a bike or walk longer distances and face hurdles trying to use public transport would get around in this hypothetical city.
Looking further into the future, probably with electrically powered pods, which are automated, they wouldn't have to drive them. You could have them very easily accessible for disabled people. So if you've got a four-wheeler, you can have it with a platform that folds out, so you can just drive a wheelchair on, or that you have a very, very smooth transition. So somebody who's got a frame or works with sticks can easily get on with their own special seats. That will be the solution for them. And if you provide one of those, or even better, if you had a comprehensive service where people could, from their mobile telephone, ring up one of these and have them come in a couple of minutes, which is entirely possible. You would only need 50 or 100 vehicles in a medium-sized city to be able to do that, at least with moderate levels of demand. Then that would be the solution for them, which I think would be much better than what they have at the moment.
I enjoyed talking to Dr. Koehler very much. I certainly learned a lot about mobility and carbon-neutral propulsion technologies. I really like the idea of slowing down travel and instead make it rather comfortable so you can work and basically live on your 1 week trip from Europe to the United States, for example. Do you think his vision of carbon-neutral mobility is something to look forward to? Let me know by email, info@scienceforprogress.eu. As always, questions, comments and suggestions are also welcome. And don't forget to check out the full episode on Patreon. Your support will be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good day. Bye-bye.